Thank you so much for coming out tonight. You have a choice of what to do with your evening, and you've chosen to come here, and I just hope you don't regret it. Dr. Butler has described the interest of St. Mary's in engaging with the world and with the local community right through to the global sphere, and that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. About climate change, about inequities in dealing with climate change and climate change impacts and what we do about climate change, and looking at it from a perspective both local, through the lens, for example, of the Community Conservation Research Network that's based here at St. Mary's, but also through work I've been doing over the last year or so with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, known as FAO. Well, in this talk, I'm going to be covering, as I said, a range of topics, starting off with a little bit about climate change. I'm not sure how many of you specialize in looking at climate change, but I'm going to run through a few points and then focus in on a whole series of what I've called for this talk inequities. So issues of impacts of climate change affecting some more than others, responses to climate change being beneficial for some more than others, basically looking at that balance and that fairness aspect in connection with climate change. But I want to start with some basics. So this is a United States website, nasa.gov, that shows the atmospheric carbon dioxide change over time. So to get started about global impacts, we have this amazing, I don't know if you can see that there, but anyway, it's supposed to be a green dot, this amazing taking off of the CO2 in the atmosphere. And so fundamentally, this is our starting point for looking at climate impacts. So as you might be able to read on the line here, so for 650,000 years, atmospheric CO2 has never been above this line until now. And of course, we're now quite a bit above that line. You know, if you've ever studied something to do with math and graphs and things like that, that's a pretty steep line there in the historic context. Of course, 650,000 years is nothing in certain contexts, but for us it's a fair bit, and so it's a striking aspect that we are facing, and in fact we've noticed this here in Canada. Just a few days ago, timed beautifully for this presentation tonight, the Canadian government released this report, Canada's Changing Climate Report, that is a really in-depth look across the country at both the kinds of impacts that we're dealing with and the consequences of those impacts. So something that you can access online quite easily. It's a bit of reading, I must say, because it's fairly extensive. But what I've got for you here is a lot of text that you probably can't read. But I just want to show you that if you want a quick look at this report, then in 2 pages, there's one page and there's another page, there are what they call the headline statements. And just to get us going for tonight, I'm not going to read this all out. I just want to give you a flavor of a few of these points. So one point that I guess maybe it's number 2 here, and maybe that's the media got down to number 2, and really this got in the news a lot. Past and future warming in Canada is on average about double the magnitude of global warming. So you might have seen that in the headlines in the last week or so. Canada's double the rate of warming of other locations. And many other aspects. Precipitation is projected to increase for most of Canada. Seasonal availability of fresh water is changing. Risks of water supply shortages in the summer. Intensifying weather extremes in the future. That's a fairly well-known consequence of climate change is more intense and perhaps more frequent climate extremes. Areas of the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans experiencing longer and more widespread sea ice-free conditions. We know about that. Coastal flooding, something that we are certainly conscious of in eastern Canada. And this a key element that we'll come back to, the rate and magnitude of climate change under high versus low emission scenarios project two very different futures for Canada. So whether we do something about climate change, whether we do a lot or whether we do a more minimal amount, makes a big difference. So that's, in a nutshell, the very large report that came out last week. And this is one diagram that I wanted to share with you tonight, again, from that same report. So if you're interested in references, it's down here, Bush and Lemon, Canada's Changing Climate Report. The left-hand side is the less extreme kind of impacts of climate change in terms of warming, and the right-hand side is the more extreme. This talk tonight is about inequities, and I want to highlight one particular. You can see that one's more red than the other, but I want to highlight that in both of those, the Arctic is a darker color than the southern part of Canada. So if we were to immediately just think about climate impacts for Canada as a whole, we would be saying, well, look, there's an inequity between the impact in the Arctic that the Inuit are facing and in the southern part of Canada. If we looked only at the southern part of Canada, we would also say there's inequities in different locations across the country. And we'll look this evening at what leads to those differences, those issues that come up of impact being different in different locations. So I'm not going to be talking about why there's a difference in impact, but really more the consequences of that. So we have this big report in Canada. We've had a number of reports. Just in the time I've been working with the United Nations in the last year or so, there have been a number of major reports coming out on climate change internationally, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let me just go back to a very sort of basic idea of where do climate impacts come, what do they look like? So we have physical trends, variabilities, and extremes. So we have the actual climate events, if you like, what you might call the physical aspects of hurricanes, droughts, sea level rise, the biological or ecological implications on agriculture, on forests, on fisheries, the direct impacts on human activities that come from that, such as what happens here in Halifax, so the impacts on cities, on natural resource users, and then we have induced impacts on society, disease outbreaks, invasive species, which is also a biological implication, but impacts potential community declines, changing way of life in the Arctic. I was just describing to a journalist earlier this evening about a visit by a wonderful Arctic Canadian individual named Peter Ernick, who was here at St. Mary's University for a talk. And while he was here, he had a phone call, and it turned out that one of his friends up north had been out on the, well, I was going to say out on the land, but actually out on the ice, so on the water, in a sense. The ice conditions were different from what he had experienced in the past, and he fell in and was very much injured. So a disastrous bit of news came here to Halifax from the north based on these changing ice conditions. So the impact is very human of some of these. When we talk about impacts, it sounds so general, but it can be very personal. So in a coastal community, like shown in the background here, we have all sorts of effects that can come from climate change. And so very specific ones like salt water getting into the water supply, like the distribution of fish off in the ocean changing over time, sea level rise, well known, of course, threaten livelihoods from the changing conditions. So any coastal community that we see around Nova Scotia although that one, by the way, is down in Maine. But any coastal community in this region, we see these different potential impacts. And if we think about impacts, well, they do vary. So I was mentioning about major reports internationally. One of the biggest one, I think, in the last year is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So this is the think tank on climate internationally. This is the body that figures out what's going on and publishes major reports on climate change. So last year, in 2018, there was a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Why 1.5 degrees? Well, that's the agreed upon target for warming. So the idea is to try to not get above that. But even at that level of warming, which might start to seem a bit optimistic to keep it to that level, to not have more warming than that. But even at that level, there are many effects. And so there's a lot of text here, but I put it all here because I just wanted you to see what is sort of the consensus, because IPCC deals with essentially consensus on what is going to happen in the future. The impacts of this warming would disproportionately affect disadvantaged and vulnerable populations through food insecurity, so problems with food supply, higher food prices, income losses, lost livelihood opportunities, adverse health impacts, population displacements. That's people being forced to move somewhere else. Some of the worst impacts on sustainable development are expected to be felt among agricultural and coastal dependent livelihoods, indigenous people, children and the elderly, poor laborers, poor urban dwellers in African cities, and people and ecosystems in the Arctic and small island developing states, like in the Caribbean or in the Pacific Islands, or in the Indian Ocean for that matter. So small island developing states. So coastal areas and small island developing states have been the focus of this UN work that I've been involved with in terms of looking at the particular locations for impact. But as I'm going to talk about, some of this is really applicable anywhere. So when we look first, and I'm going to delve into the local effects, the local inequities in a moment, but I wanted first to just give you a flavor of the big picture inequities in terms of the effects of climate change internationally. So just a few examples here. So this particular example is from Oxfam, an international development NGO organization that you can access and have a look. It's a very interesting report. And I just want to highlight what this shows is the percentage of carbon dioxide emissions by world population sorted according to the richness, the wealth of the population. So the basic key point here is that the richest 10% are responsible for about half of emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. So if we think about who is causing the problem, if you like, if we think of carbon going into the atmosphere as the essential problem, then this report is saying that about half of the problem is caused by the richest 10%, and the poorest 50% are responsible for about 10% of the problem. Now, this is organized by population, not by country as such. And I'm going to show you another analysis that's looking more at the particular countries. But basically, if we think about the essential problem of climate change, we can see from that statistic, that analysis, that countries that have contributed the least to causing climate change, well, because they're the poorest, they're also potentially facing the worst climate impacts. And they receive, and this is something I'm going to be getting into, which is not apparent from that diagram, they receive less than their share of support for the climate responses. So making the poor most impacted and least benefiting from the climate responses. But if we think about the basic challenge of reducing the carbon input into the atmosphere, I find it useful to be asking the question, how do we divide up fairly the carbon that's still to go into the atmosphere? And so there's a pile of carbon that if we're going to keep to no more warming than 1.5 degrees, there's only so much carbon that we can put into the atmosphere. That's the reality. Carbon comes from burning coal, oil, natural gas. It comes from, carbon dioxide in particular comes from a range of sources. But if we just think about heating our homes in Halifax and driving cars around Halifax, that kind of carbon emissions, this is really the essential question. Who gets to put the carbon in the atmosphere that hasn't gone in yet? It's a very simple way to look at it. It's something I remember hearing a talk by an individual named Andrew Weaver, who's a rather famous climate scientist, Canadian. You might know that he now has a different job. He actually leads a political party out in British Columbia that's sort of in a government coalition at the moment. Well, there was a point where he wasn't in that political role, but he was actually a climate scientist. He came to Halifax, gave a talk, and that was quite a few years ago. That was the first time I'd seen this idea so well put, that essentially there's only so much, if we set the target for how much warming we're willing to tolerate in the world, then there's only so much carbon that can go into the atmosphere. Who gets to put it there? Well, there's a very interesting organization that's supported, well, it's a coalition of Friends of the Earth, a major environmental organization, and some other bodies, Climate Fair Shares, that's tried to analyze this question of, if we accept that we can only put so much carbon into the atmosphere, what should be the path of different countries now to respond to that? So you can have a look at this, very interesting. You pick a country and click on it, and you see something along this lines, and I'm not sure how well this will show up. So if you can't see it well, that's Canada, Sweden, Brazil, and Indonesia. 4 countries of the world. I wanted to put Canada up there, and I picked 3 others to show you basically the different scenarios that seem to come up from the many countries of the world. So let me just give you an idea of what this is saying here. So Canada now, there's 3 lines there. The current trend, and I should say, this is 1990, 2013, 2025, and 2030 here. Possibly not to scale exactly if you worry about these things, but so essentially we're around the present, and this is moving into the future of the next 11 years or so. So this is already a little bit out of date, but that's 2025 right here. So the current trend is the top line, where the reductions in carbon going into the atmosphere that we should be looking at is the middle line there. And given the richness of Canada, we should not only be reducing carbon in the country, but also supporting poorer countries through aid programs to reduce their carbon as well. So support going internationally. So that's the logic of this particular site, is that there's 2 ingredients. There's what you should do domestically in your country, and there's what you should support going on in the rest of the world. So what you can see here is that even if we just look at the middle line here, that's the reduction compared with the trend that we're looking at that would be needed by Canada. For Sweden, it's similar, but you might notice that Sweden is a bit flatter in its top line, and so the actual decrease is less for Sweden. They've already done more of their effort on climate in Sweden. With Brazil, you can't see the kind of light blue line there. I'm sorry, you can see the light blue line, but you can't see the one below it, because basically this is saying that Brazil is a bit poorer than Canada, and so its domestic action is all that's needed for Brazil. They don't, unlike Canada, they don't also need to do some international action, if you like, for reducing carbon. I mean, that's this analysis. For Indonesia, so a bit different again here. They're being a somewhat poorer country. Their acceptable track on carbon is the same as the projected track. So you can see, I hope, the kind of light blue line that's just below the dark blue line there. They're almost the same. And what that's saying is that for Indonesia, what they need to do on carbon reduction is actually the same as their trend already. If they were to also look internationally, they would have to reduce quite a bit more. But the point here is that there's a different trajectory for Canada and for Indonesia. And that reflects this idea of inequities between the countries. So again, Sweden, Brazil, Indonesia, each with its different pathway reflecting its wealth and its history of carbon input into the atmosphere. Another way to look at this sort of global inequity in terms of the balance was in Nature. Nature is a very kind of prestigious publication, a scientific journal, and in something called Scientific Report, there was quite recently an article on the global mismatch between greenhouse gas emissions and the burden of climate change. So again, a very similar idea that shows countries that are basically getting so far a free ride on putting more carbon into the atmosphere, like Canada up in the top left here, and other countries that are down in the area of having relatively little carbon that they've already put into the atmosphere. So there's a question of what is the fair development path for different countries. This is a sensitive topic, of course, that doesn't maybe gets looked at by a lot of organizations. So if you browse the web, you'll see a fair number of examples of these sorts of analyses. But whether we see it being discussed by individual governments like the Canadian government is another question, because it's a sensitive topic, and we can talk more about that later on. Now, I want to turn to the local level, and this was some research that a colleague of mine, Barbara Patterson, and I recently published on community-based responses to climate hazards. So what do local communities do? What we've been talking about just up to now is what countries can do. And in terms of the inequities, here we wanted to look at what happens at a community level in terms of responding to climate. And let me just lead you through this a little bit. So what we were looking at was different kinds of responses. One response is taking care of families and households and making sure people had food to eat after a hurricane, let's say, after some kind of disaster. Relational well-being refers to people being able to keep their communities together, staying cohesive as communities, being aware of the hazards, the climate hazards, the governance or decision-making around what to do, and then the infrastructure, whether it might be along the coast building a seawall or restoring mangrove forests in the tropics so that you have better protection from the elements. And so we looked at different kinds of hazards around the world, what we call climatological, geophysical, hydrological, and meteorological. These are different categories of hazard based on what's called the MDAT system. And we found different results, different mixes of what kind of responses were being used by local communities. And when we looked at this, we realized that different regions of the world had different mixes of responses of those 5 kinds that I just mentioned. Again, here, these 5 in the middle kinds of responses to climate change. And we found that different regions of the world had different kinds of responses. So for example, Southern Africa had lots of 2 kinds of responses and very little of the middle 3. Okay, so these are little bar charts here. North America, up top here, has, well, a couple of bars sticking up, but overall, this is a more kind of even mix of the 5 than, say, Central America, where there's a dominance of just one response. This is the one that deals with what we call individual well-being. It's basically it's emergency response, getting food and shelter to people after, let's say, a hurricane or some kind of disaster. So Central America has a less even mixture of these responses than does North America. The Caribbean, again, has a fairly uneven mix compared with Northern Europe that's more even. So we were looking at, did community-based responses, so even though we're looking at communities, local communities, this is a global analysis. And what we found was that the different regions of the world had not only a different mix of the different responses to climate change, but different evenness of the distributions. And what that means is that in North America, we have the privilege of being able to call on all sorts of different responses to climate change. We have that capability in North America, whereas in Central America or in Southern Africa, the evenness of this distribution is much less. So we tried to figure out why is that? What's different between North America and Central America? Well, we had to do this as good researchers, although I think you might kind of figure, if you think about income levels, you might think there's a little difference. Well, sure enough, there is. So this is sorting the countries of the world according to their income level. So this is low income, medium income, and at the bottom, high income level countries. And what this shows is that poor countries don't have the same mix of responses as high income countries. So the map I just showed you of the world, you see a whole bunch of different charts there. And it's a little bit hard to kind of come to a conclusion. But when we sorted according to income, it became very clear. The poorer countries, the communities that are in the poorer countries don't have the same availability of the whole range of responses to climate change. They can't respond as effectively because they don't have as many choices. Whereas this is remarkably even here between these 5 different categories of responses to climate change. So when we talk about this idea of inequities, we see, not surprisingly, there's many things that poorer countries have a disadvantage on, and the capability to respond to climate change is one more of those. So this analysis kind of demonstrates that in a very kind of systematic way. So with all of this filtering around in terms of these impacts, what can we say about responding to climate change? First of all, local communities are very vulnerable, especially, let's say, on the coast, and especially in developing countries. There are slow processes like sea level rise and intense, frequent events like floods and hurricanes. And the basic message is that the diversity of responses is lower the poorer the country. So those countries have fewer options to deal with climate change. The work that I've been doing with the United Nations is fundamentally based around that point. So not just that we discovered this in some research, but it's been looked at in other locations as well. And so some kind of measure is needed to deal with that. So let me just say a word. Why is it that some places and some countries and some people in different locations have more impact from climate change? Well, it's typically a term called vulnerability. Locations can be vulnerable to climate change if they're right on the coast facing storms hitting them with no protection. People can be vulnerable, so that's for locations. People can be vulnerable if they're poor, if they lack food, if they lack choices, if basically they're not empowered to take action. So there's different ingredients that make people vulnerable. If you combine those two, people that are vulnerable in vulnerable locations, like parts of Africa that are stricken by drought, vulnerable locations of that sort that can be affected by changing climate, then we have a real problem. So there's exposure to climate change, the sensitivity to climate change, and what's called the adaptive capacity. Typically, the wealthier you are, the more you have the capacity to adapt. But there are other ingredients of being able or having the capacity to adapt as well, and we'll talk about that. So the vulnerability is often, by this very complex mathematical equation, exposure plus sensitivity minus adaptive capacity, because the more capacity you have to adapt, the better off you are, even if you're in an exposed, sensitive location. So as an example, one of my favorite spots, Lennox Island First Nation in Prince Edward Island. Here's a picture of the community, taken at a bit of an angle. I don't know how clear that is, but it's a pretty low-lying community on Melpec Bay, facing out on the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's a community that's dependent on ocean resources, so there's a high economic vulnerability when there's storms and effects coming from and sea level rise coming from the ocean. There's a cultural aspect of vulnerability because there's archaeological sites threatened as the sea is rising, as storms get more intense. There is a community infrastructure that is being at risk. It's vulnerable from saltwater intrusion coming into the community because, well, their sewage disposal plant is just a matter of centimeters above sea level. So it's in a vulnerable location. There's no mountain to retreat to here. It's a vulnerable location. But although my point here is about vulnerability, actually Lennox Island First Nation is one of the strongest communities I've seen in terms of taking action. In other words, they have an adaptive capacity that's really quite remarkable in spite of because of the cohesiveness of the community in particular. So the work that I've been doing with the United Nations, I had to learn this word nexus. I don't know how many of you walk down the street and use the word nexus. I'm still not quite sure about it, but it's essentially the interaction and the interplay between climate and poverty. And I'm going to throw in with poverty issues around development more generally, about food security or insecurity, but basically this idea of the climate-poverty interaction. So impacts of climate change are unevenly distributed. Those, I mentioned this before in a sense, but to be more specific, those with the worst food insecurity and poverty also seem to be facing the worst climate impacts. And climate change actually contributes to the food insecurity and poverty, directly through something like droughts, indirectly through health. So those two look like they're the same thing, but they're actually two complementary problems. One is that those who are already in poverty and lacking food face the worst climate impacts on average. And then secondly, climate change actually makes the whole thing worse. If you're in poverty, you're probably facing the worst impacts, but also those impacts will make the poverty worse. So it's like a vicious circle of danger and risk there. The Paris Agreement is the big agreed upon climate action manifesto, you might say. Not the best. It's not what everybody was looking for, but it's what we've got. And the Paris Agreement calls for considering human rights, the right to health, the right of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, person with disabilities in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality and empowerment of women. This, from the Manifesto on Climate Change for the Paris Agreement, this is the statement of why we should be concerned about how people are doing, in addition to looking at how the climate is changing, how we link those together. Some of you might have come across the Sustainable Development Goals. In the international world and in the national world of governments like in Canada, and it happens in the thinking here at St. Mary's University, the Sustainable Development Goals are really prominent. This is like the driver of our thinking around what we should be doing as a university, but also as a world, as a planet, into the future. What should we be thinking about? Number one on the list, although this is not meant to be in particular order of ranks, but number one is no poverty, and number two is zero hunger. So poverty and food security as issues are strongly in this United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Number 13 is climate action. And again, don't think of this as being in some kind of ranked order. But the focus, there's a focus on each one of these Sustainable Development Goals. And basically what we're trying to do is look at how poverty and hunger responses, so I use that word response in terms of what are we doing about these issues, and then climate responses or climate action, what are we doing about climate impacts and climate challenges. How do these come together? And you can actually look at many of these other ones. In looking at, for example, poverty and climate, gender issues are a huge factor that needs to be considered. So that's a key element, and many of these other ones are crucial as well. So there's a lot of text here, and I'm not going to go through this because that would be like really the most boring thing. So what I put this up here to do is to highlight that when we talk about climate responses, we're really talking about what's called mitigation, reducing our carbon going into the atmosphere, and adaptation, what do we do in response to the fact that we still have to deal with climate change. So we're trying to reduce climate change with mitigation and adapt to it with adaptation. And then on the poverty and food security front, there are definitions as well. And I just want to say, well, here's some definitions. I should point out that these two at the top are directly from that Canada's climate report that came out last week. These are from the report that we've been doing with FAO. So here's a big graphic that describes how we've been looking at this particular topic. Poverty impacts and climate impacts. Poverty and food insecurity cause problems. Climate causes problems. And I've mostly talked about the climate problems. I imagine that you can sort of, you already know, or you can imagine the impacts of poverty and food insecurity on people. The response nexus, we call it, is how poverty responses and climate responses interact together. We're trying to do something about climate. How does that affect what we're also trying to do about poverty? Well, one message in the headline up here is that climate mitigation and adaptation, trying to do something about climate, can make poverty worse. So that was one of the starting points in our analysis, was to say, well, what does that look like? That would look like inappropriate actions that may have negative impacts that we weren't intending. What's sometimes called perverse actions. Perverse because they're doing something you don't really want to do. You're trying to deal with climate, but you're causing worse poverty and worse food security. So can we avoid that? That's a fundamental question. The second key point, poverty can make climate responses less effective. If you're in a situation, if you are a country with a lot of poverty, let's say, and you're trying to take climate action, the very fact that people are in poverty, they're lacking food, and they don't have a lot of extra capability to do something about climate is potentially going to make climate responses less effective. I want to be clear here, that's not the fault of those in poverty. It's the situation that you see around you that makes the climate responses less possible, really. So that's fundamentally detrimental to what's called climate resilience. Being able to bounce back from climate change is harder to do when you have that poverty and food problems. So, for example, one of my students here at St. Mary's, Sabrina Booley, recently finished a thesis based on a location on the coast of Bangladesh, where she was looking at adaptation for fisheries and adaptation for farming. And she found that for fisheries, people were basically leaving the community because they didn't, as climate was changing, they didn't see any hope for that, for being able to continue in the fishery. For adaptation to farming, technological change was actually being supported by the government. So there were different kinds of responses with different implications. And all of that was interacting with other human impacts that were taking place at the same time. So thinking about the impact of climate adaptation is one of the crucial ingredients here. There are many statements of what is the fair thing to do about climate. This is one that's, I think, a nice 7 points here that from the Mary Robinson Foundation. Some of you might know Mary Robinson was the president of Ireland. She went on to work with the UNHCR High Commission on Refugees. And she has a foundation, and they look at climate justice. So a number of points that resonate with the United Nations level to do with human rights, the right to development, and that comes back to that fair share idea. And I won't go through them all at the moment, but some fundamental principles that can be applied to this response, that those arrows coming together of how we respond. So how do you get poverty reduction into the climate agenda? How do you get climate thinking into the poverty and food security strategies? How can we mesh these two together? And there's a number of international statements around this, like the Paris Agreement, that calls for strengthening global response to climate in the context of sustainable development and eradicating poverty. So already these are being pulled together. The inequities are being noticed, and we're looking at action to deal with that. So the results of our work with the Food and Agriculture Organization, with FAO, are basically figuring out some strategies. What we call entry points on the left-hand side here, and then strategic elements of a framework for action on the right-hand side. So basically what we're looking at are policies and institutions that are primarily dealing with climate, and those that are primarily dealing with poverty and development, and then sectoral ones like ones in forests and farming, so on, or urban development that aren't specifically to do with climate or poverty, but have some connection to both. And so what the report is a bunch of strategies to make climate mitigation and adaptation poverty conscious, to make poverty and food security initiatives climate conscious, and then synergies that connect these two together. Plus, for implementing that, a focus on institutions, so the actual organizations. An institution might be a department of the federal government in Canada. An institution might be an international body like the World Bank. So how do these institutions get some coherence and coordination between the climate side and the development and poverty reduction and food security side? And then a crucial one, how do we apply all this at the local level? How do we actually get the fairness coming in at the local level, like the community in Bangladesh that I was just mentioning a moment ago? So what we've developed is some strategies along that lines, and they look something like this, which, again, too many words, but each one starts with, over here are those 5 points I just raised. Each one has a kind of domino effect of how do you make that happen in practice. So to finish up, I want to focus on solutions. What do we do? What to keep in mind, there's 4 points that I want to raise here, and then what are some actual strategies that we can use. So design climate policies using a poverty reduction lens. Think about, when we're thinking about mitigation and adaptation, think about how does this impact a whole range of different players? How does this impact men versus women? How about the elderly and youth? Different ethnic groups, different classes of people. How does it affect different people within a location? Looking at basically the distribution of benefits, costs, and risks. I mentioned assessing the impact and role of women in both poverty reduction and in climate responses, and linking to sustainable development and environmental policies. What we are claiming is that considering environmental stewardship, and this is an Earth Day talk today, considering environmental stewardship in the actions can actually bring together the thinking about fairness and poverty reduction with the climate actions. And then finally, drawing on opportunities. And we point out, 5 of these: social protection, disaster risk reduction, institutional linkages, empowerment and local management, and environmental stewardship. Social protection is something along the lines of a social safety net. We kind of take that for granted in Canada to some extent, although you could debate how good our social safety net is, but some countries just don't have that and really need that when it comes to climate change. There just isn't the social protection that's needed for both dealing with poverty and food issues and dealing with climate. Disaster risk reduction is a jargon term, DRR, disaster risk reduction. It's basically thinking about climate from the point of view of disasters that might be climate related, or they could be other kinds of disasters. Depending on how you look, a tsunami, a big tidal wave kind of tsunami is arguably not, or an earthquake are arguably not climate related, but still disasters. A big oil spill, while oil might be related to climate, an oil spill is something different again. Disaster risk reduction is a big area where it can be combined with what's called pro-poor development in a synergy. Institutional linkages and policy linkages. Every country in the world has a nationally determined contribution to dealing with climate change called an NDC. And one of our recommendations is that the contributions that a country is going to make or pledging to make to deal with climate change should also be looking at the poverty and food issues as well. And then finally, the local level support and the local level action. If we were speaking to governments, we would say, think about the local scene and how you can actually improve the climate poverty connection by looking at the environment and the people at a local community level. So that ties in with some of the work that was mentioned early on with the Community Conservation Research Network based here at St. Mary's, where we have been trying to look at that local level, not just in terms of climate, but in terms of how environmental challenges such as climate connect up with stewardship, taking care of the local environment, taking care of the economy as well. So with that, I will close now and see if there's any questions, discussion. Thank you.